Mr. Bailey, I'll pass it over to you.
Thanks, Michael.
Thank you.
Yeah, sorry about that, folks. It was entirely my responsibility, actually, because being a lawyer, I brought a quill pen instead of a USB keys. Who knew? It's only been 100 years. Anyways, what I'm going to talk to you about today is collaboration. And I know there's two groups here. There's basically funders, and there's those who occasionally look to funders, or sometimes constantly look to funders for help. And I think what I'm going to say today, I hope it has resonance with both groups. And my remarks, though, are actually directed, I think, more primarily at the funder group. I think that the reason that I was asked to talk today is because I probably have a ill-deserved reputation as being candid, but to a fault. And that's why they asked me to talk to funders today, because I think there are things that need to be said. We've heard previously about the elephant in the room. Well, there's several elephants in the room, and I'm not referring to anybody physically, of course. I'm talking about, metaphorically, those issues around collaboration that we all know exist and, what shall I say, don't always acknowledge openly. But because I'm not beholden to any of the funders in the room, I have the liberty of talking about those elephants without fear of repercussion, so that's probably why they asked me to do that. Collaboration. It's become the motherhood issue. By the way, I should say something. Barack Obama and I have a couple of things in common, right? It's not basketball. It's not being the editor of the Harvard Law Review or anything like that. Two things we have in common. We're both lawyers, and the second thing is that we both have done community organizing in the past, which is somewhat unusual for a lawyer to start out that way. But my first position in the clinic system was actually doing as much community organizing as it was legal work. There was a lot of both. But I spent time organizing with injured workers, with victims of violence, with what else did I do? Oh, with tenants. And those were the three major groups that I worked with. So that's kind of like my early background in collaboration, and believe me, there was a lot involved in all of those groups. So since then, I've had other views of looking at collaboration, and really what I wanted to give you today was a few thoughts that I have on that. So it's a motherhood principle today. For funders, especially the last few years, have seen it become, and to be honest, I think there are those who would make the argument that it's almost more of an ideological rather than an evidence-based benefit. It's a feel-good thing, that it's intuitive. It's an intuitive plus to add to any project. Now, there has been some research, particularly of late, I think, that's shown that there can be real net benefits to collaboration, and that's the key, of course, is the net benefit. Because the issue always becomes, what extra resources do you have to put in because of your collaborative project, and what is the marginal return on that investment, so to speak. This is not going to be a full frontal attack on collaboration by any means, okay? Whether in the context of a funding application or otherwise. I do, in fact, think it is a good thing. And I think that it opens up, certainly there's no question that it can, to the extent that it opens up new ways of looking at old problems that could not be reached at by researchers or individuals thinking about these things in isolation and working independently, then it clearly is a benefit. And I'm going to take that as my sort of starting axiom, you might say. But let's be honest here, when funders call for collaboration, and particularly I'm talking about funders whose constituency, shall we say, is a large body of smaller nonprofits and charities, which, the statistics are pretty clear about that, right? The vast majority of nonprofits and charities in Canada are small by any measure. And so those funders in particular who fund those kinds of organizations, or purport to, they have to acknowledge the first thing. There is not a lot of capacity out there currently in any of those organizations to do, well, as Catherine Scott, I think, put it, to do anything of an administrative nature or core nature. But there's certainly not a lot of capacity there to go out and search for collaborators. And so traditionally, trying to find another organization with whom you could collaborate isn't always a welcome requirement for the fundee, shall we say, right? But it is often necessary, and increasingly is becoming more necessary. Now, this isn't the kind of creative process that most funders would like to reward, this desperate search for a collaborative partner. That's not really what funders are looking to do, but that is in fact what's happening in a good many cases. Now, I hope some of my friends in the audience will nod visibly about now, because I'm feeling a little bit like the guy who yelled, "The emperor has no clothes on," and I'd like some comment on that, okay? And I'm sure that you're all completely aware that when I do funding applications, not very often, but when I do, I'm certainly not talking about the way I go about finding collaborative partners. Of course not. But like many good lawyers, I have people come to me all the time and say, I have this friend who has this legal problem, right? So I have these friends who tell me about these problems that they have in finding collaborators sometimes. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about a few thoughts on what real, true, valuable collaboration looks like. First thing I would say is this: process is the key. And I think the example that we heard from Hamilton just shows that in spades. It illustrates a couple of points that I'm going to come back to later. But that idea of going out to find someone to collaborate with in order to get a funding application through the criteria, that is really focusing just on the apparent result, the perception of collaboration. It's not really focusing on the key element, which is the process. The process is key because it leads to, or should lead to, the identification of some common interest. And that is really the key to true, valuable collaboration. That's the catalyst. That is absolutely essential for a collaboration that will generate better, more creative ideas than the parties could have arrived at working independently. Now, traditionally, let's think about our own experience. That identification of common interests has been very ad hoc. Usually it's been based on personal context. I mean, even in the Hamilton example, we saw that. It was like one of the advantages of bringing people to this roundtable was that people who used to go up and down the same elevator together, would start to identify each other as having common interests, which they hadn't previously. And historically, that's what collaboration between particularly smaller agencies has looked like. There's nothing wrong with that. It works. The boundaries of collaboration have traditionally been determined by who you knew reasonably well. And it's no coincidence, of course, that organizations often from the same sector collaborated together. But one huge limitation of this model is, of course, that people tend to look first to people they already know and either like or know they can work well with. Now, that familiarity is good in that it builds trust and a good working relationship. The problem is that it isn't always the most creative dynamic. I think it was General George C. Scott who said something like, if all of us are thinking alike, then somebody isn't thinking, right? So as people probably sense the limitations of relying upon those ad hoc networks to look for our potential collaborators or co-collaborators, obviously people started to turn their minds to other ways of identifying these common interests. And again, now remember, I'm talking about the small nonprofit sector. Academics, for example, have never had that particular limitation, or not to the same extent, because academics have always used things like research to establish or identify networks of potential collaborators, those with common interests. But in the small nonprofit sector, we haven't been so quick to employ that. However, that's changing. And outside academia, I would point to, for example, and here I go now wearing my Social Planning Council boosters hat, the early SPCs were one of the first types of community-based organizations to actually look for objective, scientifically derived data and analysis, and to use that as part of their planning functions. And they began to use that data and the resultant analysis to identify those common interests in their communities. And they became places in the community, sometimes the only place, where those who were seeking collaboration could meet with others with a similar intent. Now, I just want to show you a few examples of how sort of data is used to identify these communities of interest that might not necessarily be that readily apparent, because that's the precursor. Can I get your help on this?